May 26, 1941, Lake Pontchartrain, near New Orleans, Louisiana. Along the edge of the water, Commander Ross Daggett of the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships stood motionless, arms folded, eyes fixed on a strange spectacle unfolding before him. In front of the concrete seawall, a roughly built wooden craft was behaving in a way no conventional boat ever should. It accelerated straight toward the wall, struck it hard enough to shudder from bow to stern, then abruptly pulled back, twisted sharply within a remarkably short radius, and lunged forward again as if intentionally testing its own limits. Each collision echoed across the lake. The hull absorbed the punishment, reversed, and repeated the maneuver with mechanical confidence. Just behind Daggett, Major Ernest Linzert from the Marine Corps Equipment Board filled page after page in his notebook, his pen moving faster with every pass. Both officers had traveled south to evaluate what senior naval officials in Washington had already dismissed as a reckless idea, another loud proposal from an Irish-American industrialist better known for his temper than his credentials. What they were witnessing, however, was not a stunt. It was a demonstration that would quietly reshape modern warfare. The man directing this controlled chaos was Andrew Jackson Higgins. What he was unveiling that day was a landing craft concept so deceptively simple and so effective that naval engineers had struggled unsuccessfully to replicate it for more than 2 decades. At the front of his boat was a steel ramp integrated directly into the bow. When lowered, it allowed soldiers, vehicles, and supplies to move straight from the boat onto land without climbing over sides or leaping into deep water. Within 4 years, variations of this Plywood vessel would deliver more Allied troops onto enemy-held beaches than every other landing method combined. Decades later, in 1964, Dwight D. Eisenhower would state plainly that without Higgins's landing craft, the Allied approach to winning World War II would not have been viable. Yet the roots of this breakthrough were not planted in military triumph but in economic collapse. In 1931, at the height of the Great Depression, Andrew Higgins's lumber export enterprise failed. His company, which specialized in moving hardwood from the Philippines and Central America, had once operated a fleet of sailing ships supported by a private shipyard he built to maintain them. When international trade froze, both the lumber business and Higgins Industries entered voluntary receivership. A sympathetic judge allowed Higgins to serve as his own receiver, an unusual arrangement that kept the companies technically alive. The Nebraska-born entrepreneur was suddenly burdened with debt, an underused boatyard, and very few options. Quitting was not one of them. Higgins's understanding of boat construction began during a short period of service in the Nebraska National Guard, but it was the unforgiving waterways of southern Louisiana that truly refined his ideas. The bayous, marshes, and coastal inlets of the Gulf region were hostile to traditional vessels. Shallow depths, submerged logs, thick vegetation, and soft banks demanded boats that could operate in as little as 18 inches of water, survive collisions, and deliberately run aground without destroying their propulsion systems. Standard hull designs proved useless in such conditions. Higgins responded by abandoning convention entirely. The result was the Eureka boat, first introduced in 1926 and continuously improved throughout the 1930 seconds. Its design combined multiple innovations that appeared modest in isolation but were devastatingly effective together. The bow curved upward in a spoon-like shape, allowing the craft to climb over obstacles rather than crash into them. A massive pine reinforcement known as a headlog strengthened the front of the hull, turning the bow into the most durable section of the vessel. Beneath the waterline, the hull geometry was unlike anything else afloat. A pronounced V-shape at the bow gradually transitioned into a reverse curve near midship, then flattened toward the stern into planing surfaces. This configuration created aerated water flow beneath the hull, reducing drag and increasing speed. Most importantly, Higgins carved a semi-tunnel into the hull to shield the propeller and drive shaft. This allowed the boat to charge directly onto shore at full throttle, rest safely with its propeller protected, and then back away without damage. The Eureka boat quickly found buyers far beyond Higgins's expectations. Oil companies used them to reach isolated drilling platforms. Trappers relied on them to move through marshland. During the final years of Prohibition, smugglers valued their speed and shallow draft for running alcohol along the coast. One by one, Higgins built these boats by hand, using their sails to keep his struggling operation alive. To stabilize his finances, Higgins formed a third enterprise in 1931, Boat Services Company. This firm purchased boats from Higgins Industries and leased or sold them to commercial users. The structure allowed him to maintain employment for nearly 50 workers during a period when businesses across the country were collapsing. By 1935, Higgins had eliminated his debts and restored financial stability through persistence and practical innovation. 2 years later, thousands of miles away, the geopolitical landscape began to shift. In 1937, Japanese forces launched a full-scale invasion of China. American military observers monitored the conflict closely, studying amphibious operations and logistical challenges with growing concern. Those observations would eventually lead the U.S. military to the shores of Louisiana and to Andrew Jackson Higgins's boatyard, where an unconventional solution had already been waiting. In the summer of 1937, high above the streets of Shanghai, a young U.S. Marine Corps officer named Lieutenant Victor Krulak stood on the roof of a building with a camera pressed to his eye. Using a powerful telephoto lens, he carefully observed a scene unfolding below him. Japanese forces were landing troops along the city's waterfront as part of the opening phase of the Battle of Shanghai. What caught Krulak's attention was not only the scale of the operation, but the vessels themselves. The Japanese landing craft were unlike anything then used by the American military. Known as the Daihatsu-class boats, they featured a deceptively simple innovation, a hinged ramp at the front of the hull. When the boats reached shore, the bow dropped open, allowing soldiers, weapons, and supplies to move straight onto land in seconds, rather than forcing troops to climb awkwardly over the sides while exposed to enemy fire. Recognizing the significance of what he was witnessing, Krulak photographed the operation extensively. Upon returning to the United States, he compiled his images and observations into a detailed intelligence report titled Japanese Assault Boats, Shanghai 1937, which he submitted to officials in Washington. The report, however, failed to make an impression. It was quietly archived with a dismissive note suggesting the author was an eccentric officer stationed too far from headquarters to be taken seriously. At the time, the American armed forces, particularly the Navy, were poorly prepared for large-scale amphibious warfare. Although the Marine Corps increasingly believed that future conflicts would require complex beach landings, the institutional machinery needed to support such operations lagged behind that understanding. Responsibility for developing landing craft rested with the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, but its designs were clumsy, fragile, and impractical. Years later, Andrew Higgins would bluntly describe those early Navy concepts as fundamentally unusable. In 1938, the Navy organized a competitive evaluation of proposed landing craft designs. Higgins, a civilian boat builder from New Orleans with a reputation for unconventional thinking, was not invited. He only learned about the trials after every submission had failed to meet operational requirements. Meanwhile, Marine Corps officers, frustrated by repeated disappointments, recalled hearing about a rugged, shallow draft vessel used by the Coast Guard for rescues in marshy waters, Higgins's Eureka boat. Rather than continuing through formal Navy channels, the Marines reached out to Higgins directly. Later that year, Higgins transported one of his Eureka boats to Norfolk, Virginia, where it underwent testing by both Navy and Marine personnel. The results were striking. The Higgins craft outperformed every existing Navy prototype. It could charge directly onto beaches at high speed, back away without difficulty, pivot sharply in confined spaces, and operate efficiently in extremely shallow water where other boats struggled or became immobilized. During large-scale landing exercises in February 1939, Marine officers watched as the Eureka boats handled conditions that would have crippled conventional vessels. Their shallow draft prevented grounding, the shielded propeller allowed repeated beaching without damage, and the distinctive spoon-shaped bow absorbed impacts that would have shattered standard hulls. Despite these successes, senior Navy officials in Washington remained reluctant to embrace Higgins's work. The resistance was not purely technical. The Bureau of Ships had invested considerable time, money, and prestige in its own programs and viewed Higgins as an outsider threatening established interests. The Navy's procurement culture favored large East Coast shipbuilders with political influence, not a blunt-spoken entrepreneur from the Louisiana swamps known for his abrasive personality and colorful language. The clash came to a head when Higgins visited Washington to meet with Bureau of Ships officials. After reviewing their landing craft blueprints, he famously grabbed a pencil and scribbled across the drawings, declaring the design worthless. The remark did little to endear him to Navy engineers, but ongoing failures of official designs left them with few alternatives. In 1939, the Navy grudgingly placed an order with Higgins for troop-carrying landing craft derived from the Eureka design, designated the Landing Craft Personnel (LCP). While the LCP represented a major step forward, Marine officers quickly identified a fatal weakness. Troops still had to exit by climbing over the sides of the boat. Under combat conditions, this meant delays, confusion, and deadly exposure. Soldiers burdened with heavy packs and weapons struggled to clear the gunwales, creating dangerous bottlenecks. Training exercises made it clear that what was merely awkward in peacetime would become catastrophic under fire. By early 1941, the solution resurfaced from Krulak's earlier observations. Drawing on the photographs he had taken in Shanghai years before, Krulak constructed a detailed balsa wood model of the Japanese ramp-equipped landing craft. In April of that year, during a meeting at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, Virginia, he presented the model to Andrew Higgins and explained how the retractable bow transformed the landing process. Higgins studied the model briefly less than a minute before grasping its full potential. Without hesitation, he called his chief engineer and ordered work to begin immediately. True to his nature, Higgins did not wait for formal approval, contracts, or bureaucratic clearance. He invested his own resources and moved at once. Within weeks, 3 prototype boats were constructed by modifying the proven Eureka hull to include a reinforced steel bow ramp. The mechanism was simple, durable, and fast. When raised, the ramp formed a solid protective bow. When lowered, it created a broad exit that allowed 4 or 5 soldiers to rush ashore side by side or enabled a jeep to drive directly onto the beach. By late May 1941, the prototypes were ready for testing. What followed would fundamentally reshape amphibious warfare and play a decisive role in every major Allied landing operation of the Second World War. Krulak would later build an exceptional military career, eventually reaching the rank of lieutenant general and earning a reputation as one of the most important strategic thinkers in the history of the United States Marine Corps. His influence extended far beyond his rank. He became a leading advocate of helicopter-based assault doctrine, a concept that would later redefine amphibious warfare in the age of jet aircraft. Krulak also documented his experiences and insights in First to Fight, a work that offered a rare internal perspective on the Marine Corps, and went on to become a foundational text in its historical literature. Throughout his long life, he consistently argued that no single battlefield innovation of the Second World War had a greater tactical impact than the Higgins landing craft. When he passed away in 2008 at the age of 95, he had lived long enough to witness the evolution of those boats from their earliest use in the Pacific Theater, beginning at Guadalcanal, all the way to modern military operations in Iraq. The story of that transformation can be traced back to a critical moment on May 26, 1941. On that day, Commander Daggett and Major Lindsay traveled to Lake Pontchartrain to observe a series of demonstrations that would determine whether months of experimental work by Andrew Higgins would be accepted or dismissed by the military. Higgins, never one for modest presentations, approached the test with his trademark confidence and theatrical flair. To simulate a real combat scenario, he packed 36 of his own workers into one of the boats, representing a fully equipped Marine platoon. The craft surged across the lake at roughly 12 knots before driving straight onto the shoreline. As the bow lifted slightly, the vessel came to a halt, its front ramp slamming down with a sharp metallic sound. In a matter of seconds, all 36 men poured out and rushed onto the beach while the engine continued to idle. Moments later, the ramp rose, the boat backed cleanly off the sand, pivoted sharply in the water, and returned to repeat the maneuver. Higgins then escalated the demonstration by driving a truck directly onto the vessel, showcasing its ability to transport vehicles. Once again, the boat charged toward shore, grounded itself firmly, lowered the ramp, and Higgins drove the truck straight onto land without pause or difficulty. The observers were astonished. What they had just witnessed was precisely the kind of capability the Marine Corps had been searching for to conduct modern amphibious assaults. Yet, despite the success of the demonstration, resistance remained. The Navy's Bureau of Ships viewed Higgins with deep resentment. For nearly 20 years, the Bureau had attempted and failed to design an effective tank landing craft. When Higgins managed to conceive, build, and test a functional version in just 61 hours, it exposed the Bureau's prolonged shortcomings. Rather than admiration, this achievement earned him hostility. The Marine Corps, however, refused to be deterred. Its leadership made clear that these vessels were not optional, they were essential, and they were needed immediately and in massive quantities. As tensions with Japan escalated in the latter half of 1941, the Navy was finally forced to act. Substantial contracts were issued for what would officially be designated the landing craft vehicle, personnel known by its abbreviation LCVP. Among the troops who would rely on it in combat, the vessel quickly earned a simpler name, the Higgins boat. That informal title would endure, even as the official designation later caused confusion among historians. Technically, the LCVP referred only to the ramp-equipped model, distinguishing it from earlier Higgins designs that lacked a front ramp. At the moment Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Higgins Industries was still a relatively small operation. Fewer than 75 employees worked in a single boatyard, and the company's total sales just 4 years earlier, in 1937, amounted to $422,000. Andrew Higgins immediately grasped the scale of what lay ahead not only for the nation, but for his enterprise. Without waiting for additional government contracts, he launched an aggressive expansion campaign that stunned both competitors and traditional business leaders. He acquired new industrial sites near City Park, along the Industrial Canal, and in the Michoud area of eastern New Orleans. Production methods borrowed from the automobile industry were introduced, replacing traditional boat-building practices. Instead of craftsmen constructing vessels one at a time, Higgins implemented assembly lines where workers specialized in individual tasks, dramatically increasing output. Equally revolutionary was his approach to labor. Higgins hired anyone capable of contributing, regardless of race, gender, age, or physical limitation. White and black workers labored side by side. Women, elderly individuals, and people with disabilities were given roles throughout the factories. In a deeply segregated southern city, this was nothing short of extraordinary. Higgins Industries became New Orleans' first fully integrated workforce, dismantling racial and social barriers that had persisted for generations, all in the service of building the boats that would carry Allied forces onto hostile shores around the world. At Higgins Industries, compensation was determined solely by the job performed, without regard to race or gender. African American and white employees worked alongside one another on the same production lines, receiving identical wages for equivalent work. Women took on roles traditionally dominated by men, operating machinery with the same proficiency as their male counterparts. When Southern industrialists criticized these practices and insisted on strict racial segregation, Andrew Higgins responded plainly and unhesitatingly. In April 1941, at the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in Nashville, Higgins delivered a speech defending the civil rights of African Americans, a stance that startled many members of the business community. Eleanor Roosevelt, present at the event, described him as one of the most forward-thinking businessmen in the United States. Higgins made his position clear. His priority was not the color or gender of his workforce, but whether they were capable of producing boats that met the rigorous standards necessary to save American lives during wartime. Employees responded with remarkable dedication. Higgins installed loudspeakers across his factories to communicate directly with all workers simultaneously from his office. When urgent orders arrived, he personally visited the factory floor using blunt, often profanity-laced motivational talks that, surprisingly, inspired the workforce rather than alienating them. Motivational signs throughout the plants reinforced the message. Any slack in effort was viewed as aiding the enemy. Workers were acutely aware that each vessel they constructed would transport soldiers into combat, and any defect could have deadly consequences. This awareness fostered a strong sense of pride and precision in their work. The workforce affectionately referred to him as Andy, a testament to both respect and admiration. In August 1942, Higgins awarded a 12% pay increase, suggesting that employees invest much of it in war bonds. The workforce complied without objection, subscribing to bonds amounting to 15% of payroll. By the end of 1943, Higgins Industries had expanded to 7 plants across New Orleans, employing more than 25,000 workers, though some reports suggest the peak was closer to 20,000 depending on how multiple sites were counted. This rapid growth from fewer than 75 employees in 1938 to tens of thousands in 5 years constituted one of the most extraordinary industrial mobilizations of World War II. The company's net sales skyrocketed from $422,000 in 1937 to over $10 million in 1941 and $144 million in 1944, with government contracts totaling approximately $350 million. At its height, the combined factories produced more than 700 boats monthly. The Higgins boat, deceptively modest in size at just over 36 feet in length and under 11 feet in width, relied on a 225 horsepower Gray Marine 671 diesel engine capable of reaching 12 knots in calm conditions. Its plywood sides and rear minimized weight and conserved valuable steel for other military production, though this offered only limited protection against enemy fire. A steel bow ramp provided partial shielding during beach landings. The shallow draft 3 feet at the stern and just over 2 feet at the bow enabled direct beaching, while a semi-tunnel around the propeller allowed safe approach and retreat without fouling on sand or debris. Each craft was operated by a crew of 4, a coxswain steering and controlling the ramp, an engineer managing the engine, and 2 crew members handling lines and operating twin .30 caliber machine guns. The boat could transport 36 fully equipped infantrymen, a jeep with 12 soldiers, or up to 8,000 pounds of cargo. Its brilliance lay not in any single attribute, but in the seamless integration of all features. Shallow draft, protected propeller, and bow ramp combined to allow rapid, repeated beach landings. Fully loaded, a Higgins boat could approach, deploy troops or cargo, and retreat in 3 to 4 minutes, enabling multiple trips per hour and rapid buildup of forces ashore. The first operational test occurred in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal landings in the Solomon Islands, marking America's initial major amphibious assault of the war. The 1st Marine Division deployed Higgins boats to transport troops directly onto coral beaches. The vessels performed with exceptional reliability, quickly landing Marines who moved into the jungle with minimal delay. Despite coral obstacles, the boats reversed off the beaches and returned for additional supplies, demonstrating the effectiveness of Higgins' design under combat conditions. 3 months later, in November 1942, Higgins' boats played a critical role in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. American forces landed at multiple points along the coast, including Casablanca in Morocco and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. The shallow draft boats proved essential, allowing troops to disembark directly into water that was waist-deep or even onto dry sand, unlike conventional landing craft which struggled with surf and shore obstacles. In just 3 days, over 100,000 soldiers and massive quantities of equipment reached the beaches efficiently. Dwight Eisenhower personally recognized Higgins' contribution with a telegram on Thanksgiving Day, 1942, a memento Higgins cherished for the remainder of his life. On Thanksgiving of that year, a message of gratitude was sent to Higgins Industries, acknowledging both management and labor for supplying the landing craft that enabled operations in North Africa. The telegram praising their contribution to the war effort was prominently displayed in Higgins' office, a reminder of the pivotal role his company played. The success of the North African campaign confirmed that the design of Higgins' landing boats was not only effective but revolutionary, prompting a surge of military orders. By 1943, Higgins Industries had reached production levels that astonished observers. Across 7 facilities, the company was completing more than 700 landing craft every month. Workers pushed themselves to extreme limits, operating around the clock in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Assembly lines were in constant motion, Plywood panels were precisely cut and affixed, engines mounted and tested, and steel ramps engineered and installed with their mechanical lowering systems. Boats, once completed, were immediately transported by rail to ports for deployment across the globe. By the end of 1943, the company had delivered more than 12,000 vessels, the majority being LCVPs in their variations. These craft were deployed in every theater of combat. In the Pacific, they facilitated amphibious operations on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and countless others that became synonymous with ferocious battles. In Europe, the boats accumulated in southern England, awaiting the invasion that Allied forces anticipated but kept tightly under wraps. Preparations for Operation Overlord, the assault on Normandy, intensified in 1943 under General Eisenhower's leadership. Planners understood that success would hinge entirely on the Allies' ability to land immense numbers of troops and supplies on beaches that lacked any port infrastructure, all while facing heavily fortified German defenses. These stretches of sand, backed by cliffs and strengthened by 2 years of preparation, demanded a craft capable of performing under relentless fire. The Higgins boat was uniquely suited to this challenge. Allied strategists estimated that over 5,000 landing craft would be needed for the Normandy invasion. Higgins Industries, along with other licensed manufacturers, bore responsibility for supplying the bulk of these vessels. Chris-Craft produced 8,620 LCVPs under license. Owens Yacht Company added 2,150, and Richardson Boat Company built 604. Combined with Higgins' own production of 12,500 LCVPs, the total exceeded 23,000 by the end of the war. The pressure on workers was immense, but they fully grasped the stakes. Higgins' messages over the plant loudspeakers were unambiguous. Each boat carried the lives of American soldiers and had to be flawless. Any defect could result in multiple deaths. Driven by this awareness, employees maintained exacting quality standards even as production surged. By early 1944, southern England's staging areas were crowded with Higgins boats, meticulously inspected, tested, and allocated to specific units. Training for crews and troops was rigorous. Soldiers learned to descend cargo nets from transport ships into small, moving boats while carrying full equipment loads of 60 pounds. They conducted repeated beach landings under simulated fire, practiced rapid ramp exits, and rehearsed navigating obstacles, preparing for conditions far more hazardous than any calm exercise could replicate. The invasion date was set for June 5, 1944, but was postponed by 1 day due to adverse weather conditions threatening smaller craft. On the night of June 5, loading began in earnest. Soldiers climbed down rope nets into boats already swaying in rough waters, some losing their grip and falling between ships or into the vessels. Seasickness afflicted many even before they left the English coast. Crossing the English Channel took hours, with waves washing over decks and crews bailing water while struggling to maintain their composure. Some boats leaked under the pounding, leaving men soaked, shivering, and acutely aware of the mortal danger ahead. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion fleet, numbering over 5,000 ships, awaited off the Normandy coast. Among them, hundreds of Higgins landing craft circled the transport vessels, filled with troops poised for the signal to move ashore. These boats, a product of relentless labor, meticulous engineering, and tireless training, would soon become central to one of the most critical operations in modern military history. At Utah Beach, located on the western edge of the American landing zone, the initial assault commenced at 6:30 a.m. Soldiers disembarked from landing craft that had grounded on the sandy shore, with ramps clattering to the ground as troops waded into water up to their knees. The German defense encountered here was far lighter than anticipated, allowing the operation to unfold smoothly. Once unloaded, the Higgins boats were able to pull back and return to the transport ships without major issues. By the end of the day, roughly 21,000 men had landed, with casualties totaling 197, an exceptionally low figure that reflected both meticulous planning and a stroke of luck. In stark contrast, Omaha Beach, situated about 15 miles to the east, presented a far more harrowing scenario from the outset. This location was the most heavily fortified of all the landing areas. The German 352nd Infantry Division had deployed strong defensive positions along the bluffs, far exceeding the expected single regiment. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were strategically positioned to create overlapping zones of fire that swept the beach from end to end. A pre-landing naval bombardment had been conducted for only an hour to maintain the element of surprise, but it failed to neutralize the entrenched defenses. As the first Higgins boats approached Omaha at 6:30 a.m., they were met by an intense barrage of gunfire that transformed the shoreline into a lethal trap. Many boats were hit before reaching land, their wooden hulls offering almost no protection against German fire. Those that did reach the sand often found themselves facing well-fortified enemy positions. Soldiers disembarking from the boats were immediately exposed to a devastating storm of bullets and shellfire. Casualty rates in the initial waves were catastrophic. Some units lost nearly their entire strength within minutes. For example, Company A of the 116th Regiment experienced a staggering 96% casualty rate in just half an hour. Bodies piled on the ramps, obstructing their closure, forcing coxswains to crawl over fallen comrades to manually lift the ramps so the boats could retreat. Despite these losses, the surviving boats returned repeatedly to the transports, ferrying fresh troops into the same deadly environment. One landing craft operator recounted, decades later, making 15 trips to the beach, each time witnessing soldiers storm the ramps into enemy fire. He retrieved as many wounded and dead as possible, sometimes using hooks to pull bodies from the water. Out of 6 boats from his ship, all crews survived, and 16 men rescued from the water managed to reach the shore and join the fight. By nightfall, around 240 Americans had been killed or injured at Omaha, the highest D-Day casualties at any beach. The beach itself was strewn with destroyed vehicles, broken equipment, and human remains, yet the relentless flow of landing craft never ceased. Reinforcements, ammunition, and supplies continued to arrive, while the wounded were evacuated back to ships. By the end of the day, American forces had secured a fragile foothold on Omaha despite the staggering losses. Across all 5 Normandy beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword landing craft, including Higgins boats, delivered roughly 156,000 Allied soldiers on D-Day. Of these, 73,000 were Americans and 83,115 were British and Canadian troops. Even at Omaha alone, more than 3,400 Americans reached the shore in the face of extreme danger. In the weeks that followed, these craft operated tirelessly, moving men and material from ships to shore. Within a month, over 850,000 troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies had been brought ashore, all accomplished without securing a single port. The ingenuity of the Higgins boats, combined with larger landing vessels and amphibious equipment, allowed the Allies to establish overwhelming force faster than German reinforcements could arrive. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1964, General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflected on this achievement during a meeting with historian Stephen Ambrose in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. When he learned that Ambrose taught in New Orleans, Eisenhower asked if he knew Andrew Higgins, then declared, "He's the man who won the war for us. Without his landing craft, we never could have executed a landing on open beaches. The entire strategy of the conflict would have been fundamentally different." This reflection did not come amid the chaos of battle, but after decades of careful analysis, assessing the key elements that contributed to Allied success in World War II. One factor stood out above most others: the Higgins landing craft. Without these vessels, the Allies' operational approach would have been drastically different. Large-scale troop movements would have required securing heavily fortified ports first, a strategy fraught with far higher casualties and substantial risk of failure. In the Pacific theater, the importance of Higgins boats was equally pronounced. The American island-hopping strategy, which pushed forces step by step toward Japan, relied on repeated amphibious assaults against islands strongly defended by Japanese soldiers committed to fighting to the last man. The battle at Tarawa in November 1943 illustrated this reality starkly. Marines landing in Higgins' craft faced lethal fire while crossing coral reefs and exposed beaches. Despite heavy losses in the initial waves, the relentless flow of landing craft eventually allowed sufficient troops to establish a foothold and overpower the defenders through concentrated force and superior firepower. The engagement resulted in over 100 American fatalities and 2,000 wounded, but it established an operational model that would be replicated throughout the Pacific Campaign. Subsequent operations at Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa followed the same pattern. Higgins boats repeatedly delivered waves of soldiers onto heavily defended shores, withdrawing to collect reinforcements and returning under fire. Though Japanese fortifications inflicted enormous casualties, the boat's capacity to continuously deliver troops ensured eventual success. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, for example, 680 Americans were killed in taking a single 8-square-mile island. During the Okinawa campaign in April 1945, these landing craft transported 30,000 Marines in the opening waves, and by the last major amphibious operation of the war, they delivered 60,000 troops ashore on the first day alone. Remarkably, the versatility of these boats extended beyond coastal assaults. In March 1945, they facilitated river crossings in Germany, ferrying soldiers across the Rhine under enemy fire. By the conclusion of the conflict in August 1945, Higgins Industries and licensed manufacturers had produced a total of 23,358 LCVP landing craft vehicle personnel vessels. Higgins Industries itself contributed 20,941 boats, including 12,500 LCVPs, 199 PT boats, various LCMs and LCTs, as well as other specialized designs. Collectively, these landing craft transported more Allied troops to hostile shores than all other methods combined, participating in every significant amphibious operation of the war across both European and Pacific theaters. Millions of U.S. service members experienced at least one mission aboard a Higgins boat, and the name itself became synonymous with amphibious landings, replacing the technical term LCVP in everyday military language. Andrew Higgins emerged as a prominent figure in the national consciousness during the war. In August 1943, Life magazine published an extensive profile detailing both his innovative approach to manufacturing and his sometimes abrasive personality. The significance of his contribution was further highlighted when President Franklin D. Roosevelt visited the Higgins plant on September 29, 1942, as part of a covert nationwide inspection of war production facilities. The visit remained classified until October 2, when newspapers finally reported it. During the tour, Roosevelt rode in a convertible alongside Higgins' Louisiana Governor Sam Houston Jones and Rear Admiral Frank T. Layton, observing the production of PT boats and discussing the company's wartime role with scale models of ships. Photographs from the visit circulated nationwide after the security blackout lifted, making Higgins recognizable to the American public. Throughout the war, Higgins received numerous military accolades, including multiple Army-Navy E awards, which recognized civilian companies for exceptional contributions to war production. The flags representing these honors were prominently displayed in his factories, and employees wore pins with pride, understanding that the recognition reflected their collective effort. Higgins held roughly 30 patents related to landing craft and amphibious vehicles. Notably, his innovations in hull design, such as the protective propeller tunnel and the distinctive spoon-shaped bow, were formalized under U.S. Patent 2,144,111, filed on December 24, 1937, and issued on January 17, 1939, setting the standard for the concept of the bow ramp, which would later become crucial for amphibious operations, was formally secured under U.S. Patent 2,341,866. The application for this patent was submitted on December 8, 1941, and it was officially granted on February 15, 1944. These patents were the culmination of many years of hands-on experience designing and constructing boats for the challenging conditions of Louisiana's bayous. Andrew Higgins, the innovator behind the design, adapted these civilian concepts for military use through close cooperation with Marine Corps officers, including Victor Krulak, who recognized the tactical advantages inherent in some Japanese landing craft innovations. Higgins himself was a forceful and unyielding personality. Throughout World War II, he frequently clashed with the Navy's Bureau of Ships. He openly challenged the bureaucrats, demonstrating repeatedly that a civilian engineer with practical, field-tested knowledge could outperform their official designs. His confrontations were not limited to military authorities. He also resisted unionization efforts among his workforce, regarding unions as obstacles to both personal oversight and maximum wartime output. Competitors who appeared to receive preferential treatment in government contracts faced Higgins's sharp criticism and public disputes. His management style was aggressive and hands-on, his language often coarse, yet his confidence in his own judgment was unwavering. Employees either admired him or despised him, but nearly all acknowledged his capabilities. He rewarded talent generously, promoted without regard to race or gender, and demanded a high standard of performance from everyone, including himself. Union conflicts became increasingly fraught as the war progressed. Higgins was vocally opposed to unions, convinced that they interfered with production efficiency and his direct relationship with workers. When union organizers attempted to mobilize employees in his plants, Higgins responded with intense resistance, sometimes skirting federal labor regulations. Strikes and work stoppages erupted, infuriating him. In Higgins's view, labor disputes were not merely inconvenient, they were a direct threat to the war effort. His inability to reconcile with union demands during wartime foreshadowed even greater difficulties in the post-war economy. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, the Navy began terminating contracts for boats that were no longer required in Europe. Following Japan's capitulation in August, accelerated by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, contract cancellations increased sharply. By October 11, 1945, all military boat contracts had been annulled. Higgins Industries had been constructed entirely around high-volume wartime production, employing over 20,000 workers across 7 plants optimized for rapid boat construction. The sudden disappearance of military orders left the company in a precarious position. In an effort to pivot to peacetime markets, Higgins attempted to manufacture pleasure craft and diversify into consumer goods. He explored aircraft production, including contracts for the Curtiss C-76 Caravan and C-46 Commando, but most contracts were cancelled before meaningful output could be achieved. Only 2 C-46A aircraft were completed before the August 10, 1944 termination of that contract. He also experimented with helicopter designs, producing a single prototype in 1946, and proposed prefabricated housing and appliances to capitalize on the anticipated post-war consumer boom. Despite these efforts, none of these initiatives could replicate the enormous revenue generated during wartime. Union pressures intensified as former wartime employees who had endured demanding working conditions for the sake of victory now pressed for higher wages and better conditions. Higgins, who had been inflexible during the war, was even less inclined to accommodate their demands in peacetime. In June 1945, he announced the layoff of approximately 1,500 workers at his City Park plant as contracts declined. By mid-August, following the termination of nearly all military orders, he projected that 2/3 of his workforce would be released. By late October, Higgins declared the closure of all remaining New Orleans plants, planning to reorganize the business in a manner that would eliminate union influence and remove the requirement for union dues. On November 9, 1945, he formally liquidated Higgins Industries. At its peak, the company had employed 25,000 workers and produced over 20,000 boats, but it was now effectively dismantled. In January 1946, Higgins established a new enterprise, Higgins Incorporated, focused on pleasure boats and limited commercial production, with his brother Frank overseeing marketing through Higgins Marine Sales Corporation. Nevertheless, the post-war magic was gone. By 1948, only one plant remained operational, with production concentrated at the Industrial Canal facility. Debt mounted as the company struggled to adapt to the civilian economy. Andrew Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at 65 years old, following a brief hospitalization for stomach ulcers and a fatal stroke. At the time of his death, the company was struggling financially. and much of his personal wealth had been depleted. His sons Ed, Andrew Jr., Frank, and Roland attempted to continue the family business through the 1950s, but persistent financial difficulties proved insurmountable. In 1959, 7 years after Higgins's death, the company was sold to a New York-based shipbuilder. One former Higgins facility in New Orleans was later converted into NASA's Mike Out Assembly Facility in 1961, playing a crucial role in producing Saturn V rocket stages and Space Shuttle external tanks. Higgins's true legacy endured far beyond the decline of his company. His boat design fundamentally changed amphibious warfare, giving the Allies the ability to bypass heavily fortified German positions along the Atlantic Wall by landing troops on beaches with weaker defenses. In this way, the Higgins boat not only enabled the success of amphibious operations but reshaped modern military strategy, ensuring that Higgins's contributions remained a pivotal element in Allied victory during World War II. During World War II, Japanese forces in the Pacific heavily fortified their islands, focusing on harbors and airstrips to anchor their defenses. The American strategy, however, relied on landing troops at locations distant from these strongpoints. Using specially designed landing craft known as Higgins boats, Marines could establish footholds on coral-strewn beaches, which quickly expanded faster than the Japanese could mount effective counterattacks. This tactical approach reshaped the conduct of amphibious warfare. It was instrumental in enabling the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the invasions of North Africa and Italy, the Normandy landings in France, and the eventual push into Germany. Virtually every major Allied amphibious operation depended on the capability these landing craft provided. The brilliance of the Higgins boat lay in its elegant simplicity. Its rounded, shovel-like bow allowed it to ascend obstacles on beaches, while the propeller, recessed for protection, enabled repeated landings and reversals without damage. The hull was engineered for both speed and agility, ensuring the craft could maneuver under fire with reliability. At the front, a steel ramp permitted troops to disembark directly onto hostile terrain, solving a challenge that had thwarted earlier landing craft designs. Each component addressed a specific tactical problem, and together they created a vessel capable of delivering soldiers onto contested shores, withdrawing cleanly and returning for multiple trips under combat conditions. The adaptability of the design was remarkable, proving effective on coral islands in the Pacific, the sandy coasts of North Africa, and the pebbled beaches of Normandy. Andrew Higgins, the boat's creator, understood watercraft on a level few civilians or military engineers ever did. His knowledge came from decades of designing and building boats to meet practical challenges in difficult environments. By the time the U.S. military required boats to operate under the most demanding wartime conditions, Higgins already possessed a solution. His earlier Eureka boat, originally intended for the shallow bayous of Louisiana, contained nearly all the critical features. The addition of the bow ramp completed the transformative design. The results were staggering. A total of 23,358 LCVPs were produced, with Higgins Industries responsible for 20,947 of them, including 12,500 LCVPs. On D-Day alone, 156,000 Allied troops were landed, with 3,400 Americans arriving at Omaha Beach, all accomplished without capturing a single pre-existing port and using beaches military planners had deemed unsuitable for large-scale operations. The impact of the Higgins boat on the outcome of the war cannot be overstated. Troops could surge down a ramp instead of scaling the sides of a craft under enemy fire, reducing casualties and increasing operational success. Entire offensives that might have failed with conventional landing craft succeeded because the LCVPs allowed forces to concentrate ashore faster than defenders could respond. Recognizing his contribution, New Orleans honored Higgins in 2000 by renaming a section of Howard Avenue as Andrew Higgins Drive near the National World War II Museum. In 2001, a memorial in his hometown of Columbus, Nebraska, commemorated his achievements, and in May 2019 he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Restored Higgins boats are displayed in museums across the U.S., symbolizing American industrial ingenuity, the ability to solve practical problems rapidly, and the scale of production achievable under wartime pressure. Higgins Industries also left a notable social legacy. Its integrated workforce, where black and white workers labored side by side at equal pay, demonstrated that racial segregation was unnecessary for industrial efficiency. This example later resonated during the civil rights movement of the 1960 seconds, showing that workplace integration could be highly productive while advancing social equality. The story of the Higgins boat underscores the value of hands-on experience over purely theoretical knowledge. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, staffed with formally trained engineers, had struggled for 2 decades to develop a suitable landing craft. Higgins, drawing on years of practical trial and error experience, solved the problem in mere months. He designed his boats to function under real-world conditions, making his civilian expertise more effective than military bureaucracy. This lesson influenced U.S. military procurement for decades, proving that specialized civilians could sometimes outperform established military systems when rapid innovation was required. Today, visitors to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans can see a restored Higgins boat, its plywood hull, recessed propeller, and steel ramp on display. Though modest in size and appearance, these vessels successfully crossed rough seas, landed troops under fire, and repeatedly returned to pick up more soldiers, a feat difficult to imagine without witnessing the design firsthand. Andrew Higgins passed away on August 1, 1952, at the age of 65, leaving behind a company that had faded and a personal fortune largely depleted. Yet the impact of his boats endured, carrying millions of American soldiers into battle and shaping the Allied victory. Dwight D. Eisenhower, reflecting in 1964 on the lessons of 2 decades past, captured the essence of Higgins' contribution. The man's innovation had enabled assaults on open beaches that were otherwise considered impossible, fundamentally altering the strategy and outcome of the war.